In the history of the world, there was seldom been a more savage sport or amusement than the games that took place in the arenas and colosseums of the ancient Roman Empire. Some of the games were wild beast hunts in which men with spears pursued a prey that was unable to escape, then slaughtered it. In other games, only animals were pitted against each other. And sometimes, as when Christians were being persecuted, unarmed men and women were simply thrust into an arena teeming with half-starved lions. But perhaps the most bloodthirsty sport, the one most beloved by the spectators, were the battles between the gladiators. On any day the gladiators were scheduled to fight, the amphitheater was densely packed, and outside would be lines of hundreds more still hoping to be admitted. The gladiators were recruited from the thousands of slaves taken throughout the conquered territories of the empire. Any man who looked young, exceptionally strong or swift, and seemed to have a fighting spirit was a candidate for the arena. These men were not volunteers. They were sent off in chains to be trained, and if they resisted, they were severely punished. When training was over, they would one day find themselves in the middle of the amphitheater, armed and facing an opponent who sometimes had once been a friend back home. Then there would be a fight to the death. If there was just a fight but no death, the crowd would jeer. The favorite moment for the spectators was when one opponent finally had the other on the ground in defeat and looked to the crowd for its verdict, which was almost always the signal of death. Then he would plunge his dagger into the helpless body for the death blow. At each event, spectators would cheer as tens and hundreds of gladiators battled and killed each other with swords, spears, tridents, and weighted boxing gloves. When the battles were over, survivors staggered out or were carried from the arena, often with deep wounds, jagged cuts, and life-threatening injuries. At one arena, waiting inside to mend them, put them back together, and hopefully save their lives, was a man named Claudius Galenus. Today, the world knows him simply as Galen, one of the world's first true physicians, and a man whose work dominated the field of medicine for over 1,500 years. If there was anything productive that came out of the brutal gladiator fights of the 2nd century Roman Empire, it was the discoveries and knowledge that came to Galen as he worked on the hundreds of injured victims. In these days, the dissection of human bodies was frowned upon, and physicians had no way to directly study the internal organs and functioning of the human body. Most of their theories were based on speculation or superstition. But Galen's task gave him the rare, if tragic, opportunity to examine the body inside and out, and to experiment with different medical treatments. Galen himself was not a Roman. His parents were Greeks, and he himself was born in a town called Pergamum, located in what we now know as Turkey. When Galen was born, it was part of the vast Roman Empire that Julius Caesar had helped establish. In the year Galen was born, 130 A.D., there had been no significant advances in medicine for over 500 years, since the time of the ancient Greek physician Hippocrates. Very little is known about Hippocrates' life, but his work, or what we know of it, earned him the title Father of Modern Medicine. He lived during the days when ancient Greeks were making extraordinary contributions in the arts, science, and government, and when philosophers like Socrates, Plato, and Aristotle were transforming human thought. It was also a time, until Hippocrates, that the treatment of illness was mired in pagan ritual and superstition. Healing power was believed to be in the hands of the gods, and particularly the god Aesculapius, son of Apollo, grandson of Zeus. The Greeks built temples to Aesculapius that were something like today's health spas. They were set on beautiful, lush hills near mineral springs. Inside the temple, robed priests sang prayers and told stories of the miraculous healing power of Aesculapius. A patient would sleep in the temple, have a dream or a vision, and the priest would interpret these so he could prescribe a treatment. Sometimes the priest would outline a special diet or exercise. Other times he would simply suggest that an instant cure would take place. Since most illnesses pass on their own, and many can be affected by positive thought, the therapy or prediction of a cure was believed to be powerful. In cases where the therapy didn't work, it was blamed on the patient, not the priest. It was Hippocrates who first suggested to the world that medical ailments and cures had little to do with superstition and more to do with the condition of the human body. Disease, he said, was caused by natural, not unnatural causes. It was Hippocrates' theory that illness occurred when the body was out of harmony with nature, and to restore health, one had to first restore balance. He believed, as did all Greeks, that health relied on 4 essential substances which they called the humours: blood, black bile, yellow bile, and phlegm. These humours, or body fluids, had to be in perfect balance, or the body would become ill. Hippocrates made a serious study of all his patients. He observed and recorded symptoms, but also made it his priority to put the comfort and welfare of the patient first. He combined a rational approach to the body and a compassionate approach to the person that has ever since remained the ideal of all dedicated physicians. Hippocrates was the first to set both scientific and ethical standards for his profession. These ethics were later summarized in the Hippocratic Oath, an oath that is still repeated at graduation in a number of current-day medical schools. Hippocrates didn't write the oath himself, but it did come out of his medical school, and it reflects his personal principles. Hippocrates recorded his many medical findings in a collection of works that included such subjects as general pathology, the description of the disease process, the pathology of specific diseases, diagnosis, prognosis, treatment, embryology, gynecology, and surgery. This work launched the scientific study of medicine and began to loosen the chains of ignorance and superstition that had held it back for centuries. The knowledge of Hippocrates spread throughout the ancient world and was adopted especially by the Arabs. Then, once again, progress seemed to come to a halt. It would be 5 more centuries before Galen came along, took the work of his ancient colleague, and propelled medicine another leap forward. Galen's father was a talented architect, and in many ways, Galen saw similarities in their professions. He once said, "A physician needs to study anatomy as an architect needs to follow a plan." The father, Nikon, was supportive of Galen, who once described him as amiable, just, and benevolent. In fact, the family name, Galenus, means calm or serene in Greek. The name did not, of course, belong to his mother by birth, and Galen offers an entirely different view of her than he does of his father. He even compared her to Socrates' wife, Xanthippe, a well-known shrew. Galen said of his mother, "She had a very bad temper. She was so irascible that she used to bite her serving maids, and she was perpetually babbling and shouting at my father." Galen claimed he had taken after his father. His contemporaries claimed that, although he had his father's brilliance, he had a temper that clearly came from his mother. Galen's father was a farmer as well as an architect, so as a boy he was raised on the family farm outside Pergamum. Pergamum was the capital city in the state of Mysia, and as such it had both a magnificent library and a beautiful temple. The temple was one of the famous shrines to Aesculapius, the god of healing. Many of the most distinguished personalities of the Roman Empire visited the shrine in hopes of finding cures for their various ailments. Attached to the shrine was a medical school, where Galen later met important physicians and observed the treatments for diseases. The shrine had a profound influence on both him and his father, and may account for a dream his father had that launched Galen's career. Galen discovered his profession not through an inborn passion or an irrepressible curiosity, but because of a dream that wasn't even his. His father dreamed one night that Aesculapius, the god of healing, had come to him and announced that his son would be a great doctor. In ancient times, people took their dreams very seriously and believed they were often prophetic, so Nikon had once determined to give his son the best education possible. His early training was not in medicine, but philosophy, the field Greeks believed to be the foundation for all other human knowledge and endeavors. His studies included the 4 leading philosophical systems of his time: Plato's, Aristotle's, Stoicism, and Epicureanism, based on the teachings of Epicurus, the man who believed the purpose of life was pleasure. When he finished his education in philosophy, at the age of about 19, he felt ready to train as a physician. Training he pursued with great energy and ambition. For Galen, training took almost the form of an odyssey. He traveled far and wide, actively seeking the best schools and teachers to assure himself he had the most excellent education possible. The quest started in Smyrna, now Izmir in Turkey, where he attended the lectures of the celebrated physician Pelops. From there he made his way through Greece, Phoenicia, Palestine, Crete, and Cyprus, finding the experts and adding to his storehouse of knowledge all along the way. Finally, he arrived at the famed medical school of Alexandria, Egypt. Learning was never a passive process to Galen. It was an active process in which the student sought, dug, questioned, examined, analyzed, and led himself towards his own discoveries. When he arrived in Alexandria, Galen was in the city that was a rival to his own, Pergamum. More specifically, there was competition and jealousies between the great libraries in each city. The rivalry was so bad that Egypt refused to export its papyrus to Pergamum, hoping the library would then have no material on which to copy its great works. What happened in response changed literary history. Pergamum, deprived of papyrus, invented parchment, a type of writing material made from animal skins. Where papyrus had to be rolled up, parchment lent itself better to the book shape. The rivalry between the two cities had led to the first step in the development of the book, the form in which Galen would later make his own important writings on medicine. It was when he returned home to Pergamum at the age of 30 that Galen was appointed surgeon to the gladiators, the post that gave him many opportunities to examine human anatomy and study treatments of wounds and broken bones. According to reports of the time, he was so skilled at his work that not one man under his care died, though many had suffered severe injuries. Galen served the gladiators for 3 years, and by the time he was done, he had become an accomplished surgeon. Now began his years of intensive research and important discovery. Galen was the first person in the history of medicine to use experiments in seeking the answers to questions that had eluded him. For that reason, he's often called the founder of experimental physiology. Because social taboos prevented him from working directly on human bodies, Galen turned to the next best thing: animals. He dissected pigs, dogs, goats, other animals, and his favorite subject, the Barbary ape, or as it's more commonly known, the African monkey. Although it would be another 1,700 years until Charles Darwin shocked the world with his theories of evolution, humankind had already been observant enough to note the similarities between the physiology and behavior of apes and human beings. As he studied the internal workings of monkeys and other animals, Galen kept meticulous notes and uncovered many secrets about nerves, muscles, and the circulatory system that until then had been completely unknown. Some of his discoveries he misinterpreted. His biggest error was in assuming that what was true of animals was inevitably true of humans. For instance, he once carefully described a network of blood vessels under the brain that's present in many animals but not in humans. Then he gave it an important role in the functioning of the human body. But he discovered many other things that still hold true today. His work on muscles was particularly good, and he identified many for the first time. He was also the first to describe how muscles work in harmony, and to observe how the muscles of the diaphragm and thorax help expand the chest so the lungs may fill with air. Galen demonstrated the importance of the spinal cord by severing it at different places in animals and observing the paralysis that resulted. His work on the spinal cord laid the foundation for modern research on the central nervous system. By studying the nerves of the larynx, he identified it as the source of the voice and laid to rest previous beliefs that the voice emanated from the heart. He proved, too, that speech comes from the brain, since the nerves originate there. Even though he wasn't allowed to dissect human bodies, there was no law forbidding him from working with human skeletons, so Galen examined several and then accurately described all the bones and their connections. He was also the first to describe the flow of urine through the ureters and into the bladder. When it came to the circulatory system, Galen had both some hits and some misses. He found that arteries contain blood and not air, as people previously believed. He described the structural differences between veins and arteries. He recognized it was the heart that pumped the blood into motion. He also believed that blood was manufactured daily from the food we eat, and that nutrition is supplied by the blood as it moves up and down the veins. But he ran into trouble when he tried to figure out how the blood in the left half of the heart gets to the right half. His idea was that there were tiny holes or pores, too small to see, in the wall separating the two halves. Because of this, he misunderstood the functions of the heart and circulatory system that would wait another 1,500 years until the British physician William Harvey discovered it in 1616. In Galen's view, the most important organ in the vascular system was the liver, where blood was formed and the veins originated. He thought blood vessels carried the blood out to the edge of the body, where it was transformed into flesh. Nevertheless, it's to Galen's enormous credit that he was the first physician to use the pulse as a diagnostic aid. He even used the pulse to make some explorations into the psychiatric treatment of psychosomatic illnesses, preceding Sigmund Freud by 1,800 years. The story he wrote about this involved the case of the wife of an aristocrat. Her doctor had been treating her for an organic complaint, but she had failed to improve. While taking her pulse, Galen mentioned an actor and dancer named Pylades, whom town gossip had her linked with romantically. As soon as he mentioned the man's name, her pulse took a noticeable jump. Galen observed her for a few more days and then made the following note. On the fourth evening, I kept very careful watch when it was announced that Pylades was dancing, and I noticed that the pulse was very much disturbed. Thus I found out that the woman was in love with Pylades, and by careful watch on succeeding days, my discovery was confirmed. Galen went even a step further into the unknown territory of psychosomatic illnesses. He tried telling her funny stories, and noticed that when she laughed, her condition improved. Her laughter, he said, was the beginning of her cure. In spite of his spirit of challenge and discovery, Galen held on to some of the key principles put forth by Hippocrates 500 years earlier. He too taught that the body was composed of 4 humours: blood, phlegm, and black and yellow bile. He, like Hippocrates, used the 4 elements, earth, air, fire, and water, and for qualities, heat, cold, dryness, and moisture, in his treatments of disease. For instance, for inflammation, which was heat and dryness, he would apply coolness and moisture, as we today would use wet compresses. Using the same principles, he would prescribe massages, exercise, and simple vegetable drugs, which are still known today as galenicals. As a diagnostician, there was no one of Galen's time who even approached his skill. His knowledge of anatomy and his sense of the body as a whole, with interconnected parts, gave him unique insights into medical problems. As an example, he was once approached by a man who had lost the sensation in the 4th and 5th fingers of one hand. He'd already tried several other doctors who had recommended poultices, salves, liniments, none of which worked. Galen, unlike many doctors of his time, was always willing to take on patients whom others had declared incurable. This often aroused the jealousy of other physicians, particularly those who had made the incurable verdict in the first place. When Galen first met the man with the numb fingers, he did something it had never occurred to the other doctors to do. He asked for the man's medical history. In doing so, he discovered his patient had recently fallen off a chariot and struck his neck against a rock. With his knowledge of anatomy, Galen immediately realized the man had injured nerves in his neck, which then affected the nerves of his hand. When he treated not the hand as the others had done, but the neck, the man dramatically improved. By now, Galen's fame had spread far beyond his hometown of Pergamum. It was time for bigger and better things. In 162 AD, when he was 33 years old, Galen moved on to the center of the empire, Rome itself. There he practiced medicine, taught students, and carried on his inventive experiments in physiology and anatomy. In Rome, Galen's fame and fortune grew rapidly. His patients included the highest officials in the state, many of whom also attended his lectures and demonstrations, even though they weren't medical students. He cured the ailing philosopher Eudemus, who was a disciple of Aristotle. He became friends with the emperor Marcus Aurelius and with two future emperors, Commodus and Septimus Severus. As a practicing physician, much of Galen's success had to do with the fact that he'd been schooled in philosophy. This earned him just as much respect as his medicine. To the ancient Greeks and Romans, no discipline or study could be separated from their view of God. Galen played almost as influential a role in the religious and philosophical history of his age as he did in its science. He was, as most Greeks and Europeans were, an admirer of Aristotle, the first philosopher to emphasize observation, deduction, and mathematics in his theories. Like Aristotle, Galen believed that nature was created perfect by God, that everything in it had a function and purpose. They also believed that through the study of nature and its complexities, they could gain greater understanding of God himself. God works by laws. Therefore, natural law would reveal him. The dedication and zealous curiosity Galen brought to his work was partly a reflection of his underlying spiritual quest. It was this combination of philosophical and medical skills that helped Galen become a favorite of the Roman Emperor Marcus Aurelius, who made the now famous comment, "There is only one physician, Galen." During the times Galen lived, Christianity was rising in power throughout Western Europe. Although he himself was never a Christian, he did develop a form of monotheism, the belief in one God. His belief that the human body was a vehicle for the soul and reflected this one God's perfect designs, when combined with his scientific writings, made Galen the undisputed authority in medicine throughout the Middle Ages, when the Christian Church reigned supreme. It was dangerous to dispute his theories and could lead to excommunication, imprisonment, and even execution for heresy. Because of this, the man who pushed science forward would inadvertently hold it back for many centuries. Besides his demanding work as a doctor and a researcher, Galen was a tireless writer who produced over 400 treatises, of which only 83 survive. Even these make up 22 thick volumes that would take several years to read and absorb. The volumes include some biographical notes that are among the earliest autobiographical writings in history. They also include Galen's own index, the first bibliography in world literature. These innovative papers took a fresh look at anatomy, physiology, philosophy, pathology, dietetics, logic, hygiene, and pharmacy. He even wrote critiques of earlier studies made by Hippocrates, a man he scorned, even though he himself had adopted several of his principles. These writings often engaged him in arguments with other physicians, most of whom he had little regard for. He could be violent in his opinions, arrogant and unyielding, not uncommon traits in people forced to defend themselves against those who cling stubbornly to the past and the false. But he also had a bad habit of claiming that everyone who disagreed with him was merely jealous of his success. Galen had been in Rome several years when the city was hit by the plague, and he fled back to his hometown of Pergamum. That, at least, is what historians believe. Galen himself says he left because the envy of other Roman physicians had become intolerable. He was recalled to Rome 2 years later by the emperor Marcus Aurelius to serve as physician to his son and heir. Galen was now 40 years old. He would spend the last 30 years of his life in Italy serving as court physician in Rome until the city became the scene of political turmoil. He then settled in the south of Italy, probably in Sicily, where he remained until his death in 200 AD at the age of 70. It was the close of one century and the beginning of another, the end of one chapter in medical history and the start of a new one. In his later years, Galen had devoted himself to further experimentation and demonstration of his findings, and tried to cope with the intense controversy and opposition his work had created. He continued to challenge the medical community, assaulting outdated, unproven theories and creating hostility in his conservative colleagues. Research, he felt, was the only reliable method for uncovering the truth. He wrote, "I have continued my practice on until old age, and never yet have I gone astray, whether in treatment or in prognosis, as have so many other doctors of great reputation. If anyone wishes to gain fame through these, and not through clever talk, all that he need is, without much ado, to accept what I have been able to establish by zealous research." Galen had not been just a dedicated researcher, but a prolific writer, an eminent physician, a renowned teacher, and a respected philosopher. A Renaissance man 1,200 years before the Renaissance started. So broad were his interests and accomplishments that he earned the reverence of not just his colleagues, but his entire society. His conclusions on medical issues went unchallenged for a millennium and a half. It was considered heretical to challenge the views of Galen, just as in astronomy it was heretical to challenge Aristotle. Limited as he was by his resources and his times, Galen made many prominent mistakes. Just the same, his positive achievements have proved to be of enduring value. Although he was a talented and successful doctor, he's remembered today for his research work in anatomy and physiology. It was this that helped lay the foundation of modern medicine. He added a great deal to humankind's knowledge of the body, especially the brain, spinal cord, pulse, and nerves. These discoveries were very advanced for their time, and in fact, many of the areas he studied are still being pondered today. Although modern physicians can claim far superior textbooks, instruments, and facilities to Galen's, many of the keys to human anatomy, and especially the brain, remain elusive even 2,000 years later. The path of knowledge and understanding in the field of medicine has been a long and slow one, but occasionally, as in the case of Claudius Galenus, there is one brilliant, undaunted mind that spins us into a new era and closer to the final goal.